My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. So a couple of things. First off, an apology. It's been a while. I missed last week. I was just too busy working on the book. I promise I will continue to put out the podcast, but it's probably just going to be a little bit slower, maybe once every 3 to 4 weeks rather than my normal once every 2 weeks until I get the book out. I apologize for that again. It's just something that is difficult to get around. I'm writing 2,000 to 3,000 words a day, depending on the day. And I had a couple of other things come up that I just had to take care of. Another thing, I forgot to mention in a previous episode that a few weeks ago I got an article published in The Economist. It's sort of related to this podcast. The article was on the rising popularity of Kung Fu in Africa. It was a really fun piece to write. I'll link to it on the website in case you want to read it. I know this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, not the Chinese Film Podcast. I've been thinking about mixing it up and doing films every once in a while. Maybe I'll actually do that for the next episode. I'm not sure. See how folks like it. Either way, I thought that y'all would be interested that I'm getting published in a newspaper as prestigious as The Economist. I'm sure some of y'all will remember I interned at The Economist in London way back in 2016, just as the podcast was getting started. Okay. That's enough prefacing for today. Let's get down to the topic. Bai Xianyong, his name is sometimes spelled P-A-I space H-S-I-A-N-Y-U-N-G in English. That's sometimes how it's spelled because he's from Taiwan, and so he uses the different Taiwanese romanization systems. But his name is pronounced Bai Xianyong, and in Pinyin, his name is just B-A-I-X-I-A-N-Y-O-N-G. I think using Pinyin is so much simpler. It's a much better system than anything they have in Taiwan. I love Taiwan, but Pinyin is just much, much better than their romanization systems. Who is Bai Xianyong? Bai Xianyong is born in 1937 in Guilin, over in China. It's a famous city for tourists because of the beautiful limestone karsts that come towering out of the ground. His father is a very important figure in the KMT, that is the political party dictatorship that's running China, sort of, from around 1925, 1926, when they take over most of China, to 1949, when they're kicked out of China by the Chinese Communist Party. Bai Xianyong's dad is named Bai Chongxi. His father is one of the warlords with Chiang Kai-shek to rule the country at the time. Chiang Kai-shek, as I know we've discussed on the podcast before, he's the head of the Republic of China and also the head of that party, the KMT. Bai Chongxi is very important. From 1946 to 1948, he's going to become the Minister of Defense for the Republic of China. Beyond his military position in the government, Bai Chongxi is also one of the most prominent Muslims in China. Today, China is one of the least diverse major countries. When you compare it to something like India, it's just nowhere near as diverse. But that's not always been true. 500 years ago, and at other points in Chinese history, you have a China that's been much more multicultural. So during the Tang Dynasty, the glorious Tang Dynasty, the sort of apogee of Chinese culture, China was run by a group of people who claimed to be Chinese, but they're really more Turkish or Turkish influenced. The Turks, of course, lived in northwest China and what is today Mongolia. And they ran many dynasties about 1,500 years ago. So Chinese history is a lot less monochromatic than one would expect if you just went to China today. There is a lot more diversity in China in the past. Bai Chongxi is one of the products of that diversity. Bai Chongxi's ancestor is a Persian merchant. He comes to China. He's selling his wares. He marries a woman, a Chinese woman, and settles down. His descendants stay in China, but they also stay Muslim. Bai Chongxi's Muslim name is Omar, thus he would be called Omar Bai. He is, for a period, actually the head of the Chinese Muslim Association and one of the most important Muslims in China. Actually, I'll just say I think he's probably the most important Muslim in China at certain periods. Bai Xianyong, his son, I don't think he practices Islam today, but he grew up in this Muslim milieu. Bai Xianyong is born in 1937 to this very important Muslim family. His dad is a high-level official in the government of the KMT or ROC. But as all of y'all know, the ROC is going to, like I mentioned before, lose the civil war with the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. Much of the elite in the KMT and the ROC, they're going to flee, they're going to leave China. Like many families of means, Bai Xianyong's family first flees to Hong Kong, a British colony. Bai Xianyong goes to school there, actually. He spends much of his secondary education career in Hong Kong. But the government of the ROC actually reconstitutes itself on Taiwan. So they flee China, and then they sort of come back together in Taiwan. The ROC and the KMT, I'm just going to start saying the ROC because that's confusing. They're pretty much the same thing, the ROC and the KMT. The ROC had never lost control of Taiwan. Taiwan is the one point of the country that they control that they never lose their grip over. Bai Xianyong eventually finds his way to Taiwan. He goes to college there in Taiwan. At first, he wants to be an engineer. He actually is so China-focused that he wants to build the Three Gorges Dam. But eventually, he becomes an English major. He sets his heart on becoming a writer, and he moves to university in Taipei, the National Taiwan University. It's the top university in Taiwan, hands down. And while he is there, on March 5th, 1960, Bai Xianyong establishes a magazine called Modern Literature, 现代文学. Modern literature is going to become one of the most important literary outlets in Taiwanese history. The magazine publishes important translation of modernist Western writers. So that is, when you think about modernism, you think Joyce, Proust, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. All of those types of writers are being published in this magazine in translation, giving the Taiwanese a window onto this broader discourse of modernism. Bai Xianyong and the other folks at Modern Literature didn't just publish translations, they also wrote some modernist literary works themselves, and they actually became the proponents of this movement of modernism in Taiwan. Let's talk a little bit about this movement of modernism. As I mentioned, modernism didn't start as a literary movement in Taiwan. Europe and the U.S. had a movement called modernism starting in the 1920s and on into the 1930s. Taiwanese modernists like Bai Xianyong drew off this earlier generation of Euro-American modernists. But they're also going to transform modernism and make it into something that's not quite the same thing as what you have in Europe and in America. They're going to mold it to fit modernism into Taiwan's literary and political situation in the 1960s. So these modernists advance modern literature in a very special way. They're not just copying Western modernists. They do that some, but it's not entirely just a carbon copy. They modify modernism. I was going to say, I would argue that Taiwan's literary modernism creates something special, but you don't even have to listen to me. You can just listen to C.T. Shah, who's really the dean of modern Chinese literary studies. This is what he said in the History of Modern Chinese Literature, one of the first literary histories of modern Chinese literature. Quote, Taiwan since 1961 has enjoyed a minor literary renaissance of genuine promise, even though few Western readers are yet aware of its existence. And I'll have to say, sadly, even today, so that was penned in 1970, even today, most Westerners are not really aware that this modernist experiment happened in Taiwan from around 1960 to the 1970s and 1980s. Something that I'm going to try and redress with this podcast. Some important things you need to know about Taiwanese modernism. First off, Taiwanese modernists reject traditional Chinese literary thinking. I've talked about this on the podcast. There's this phrase. It comes from a Zhou dynasty text that's about 2,500 years old. 是言志. The phrase literally means something like poetry expresses one's feelings, poetry expresses one's desires. You can translate it a couple of different ways, but either way, It's the most important phrase in traditional Chinese literary theory. If you understand this phrase, you can understand Chinese literature from pretty much its earliest stages to the Taiwanese modernists writing in the 1960s. The point of poetry for most Chinese literary theorists, the point of all literature in traditional Chinese thinking, is that it's supposed to be about exposing inner truth. It's supposed to be about exposing the real self. This is the real way I feel. This is my inner subjectivity. That's what literature, that's what poetry does in traditional Chinese thinking. And really, if you think about the poetry that we've done on the podcast, Li Bai, Tao Yuanming, Su Dongpo, all of them probably wrote this way, but all of them are definitely read in this way. So when you have later Chinese thinkers interpreting Su Dongpo, Tao Yuanming, Li Bai, they're always interpreting them in light of this 诗言志 thinking, that poetry expresses their innermost feelings. Poetry expresses their innermost self. Taiwanese modernists break from that old way of thinking about literature. Drawing off Western European writers, they put some distance in between the author and the text that the author is writing. So, this is just basic literary theory, but today we don't expect that the text has to reflect the author's feelings. That doesn't really happen in Chinese literature until around the 1960s with this Taiwanese modernist break. And then you start with the Taiwanese modernists, you start to see this separation between what the text says and what the author really thinks. Okay, so that's one thing that's very different about Taiwanese modernist. The second thing is that they are really into this theme of exile. This theme of exile is not foreign to Western modernist thinkers. When you think about Joyce, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, they're all writing somewhere far away from home. And they're oftentimes writing about home in some way. The theme of exile is very much a part of all modernist literature. But in Taiwanese modernism, it's particularly stark. Most of the men who wrote modernist literature had been born in China, or they had been born to parents who had just fled China. They were being raised in a society in Taiwan where everyone is forced to believe that the ROC, they're isolated in Taiwan, is just in a few years going to run back to China, kick out the communists, and take their country back, that they are in this kind of state of exile. They really did think of themselves as Chinese, not Taiwanese. So it's actually completely anachronistic of me to say Taiwanese modernist. They would not have accepted this label of Taiwanese modernist. Bai Xianyong, he's still alive. He's 87. He would reject the notion that he is a Taiwanese modernist. Okay, let's jump into the text that we're actually looking at today. The short story that we are looking at is called Winter Nights. It's a story by Bai Xianyong. Like I said earlier in the podcast, it's from Bai Xianyong's one of his most famous works, probably his most famous work, called Taipei Ren. Something like Taipeiers, people of Taipei. So this 1971 collection of short stories is called Taipeiers. It's a series of stories about people living in Taipei, but most of them are not actually from Taipei. That is, they're not Taipeiers. They are people who are born in mainland China and they wound up in Taipei somehow, but they think a lot about going back to China. This is true of the characters in Winter Nights. The two main characters in the story are Professor Yu Qinlei, who's a professor there in Taiwan. He teaches English literature in Taiwan, though he once had been at some of the best universities there in Beijing before the communists took over and he had to flee to Taipei. He did his dissertation on Byron, and he's been working on this translation of Byron while he's teaching English literature there. The second character in the story is Wu Zhuguo. Professor Yu and Professor Wu knew each other way back when they were in Beijing. In fact, they last saw each other in the late 1940s in Beijing, just before the communists took over. When the story picks up, we actually meet Professor Wu. He's kind of this rock star of the academic world. He's Taiwanese, or he's a citizen of the Republic of China. He's not Taiwanese. He actually hasn't lived in Taiwan that long. But Professor Wu is a citizen of the ROC. Therefore, today we would think of him as kind of Taiwanese. He has this connection to the government on Taiwan, even though he's a professor at an American university. But the fact that he's a professor at an American university makes him kind of a god in the Taiwanese context. Even though, if he were in America, it's implied he's a professor at one of the lesser University of Californias, which University of Santa Barbara is where Bai Xianyong himself actually taught Chinese. So there's more than a little bit of autobiographical elements there in this Professor Wu. So Professor Wu gets off the plane at Songshan Airport there in downtown Taipei. He's rushed by crowds trying to meet him. Professor Yu is in that crowd. He wants to meet Professor Wu. It's really hard because of all the crowds around him, so they briefly talk and they arrange to have dinner later on. After they meet, the story picks back up with Professor Yu rushing home despite having a limp. He's rushing back home to get ready for the great Professor Wu to come to his house. Professor Yu had wanted his new wife to join him, but she's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go and play some mahjong with the neighbors. It's pretty clear from the way the story describes it that they have a less than ideal relationship. And he thinks back to his first wife in China, who was so welcoming to Professor Wu when they were just friends. Professor Wu comes over to Professor Yu's house and they talk. They talk about all their old revolutionary friends. They talk about how little they themselves have accomplished compared to what they thought they were going to accomplish when they were young. And we learn that both Professor Wu and Professor Yu were not only these up-and-coming scholars in the 1940s there with positions in Beijing, but they were also involved quite heavily in the May 4th movement. I've talked about the May 4th movement in other podcasts. I'm not going to linger over it here, but 1919, May 4th, you have this big protest in China that really changes everything. It rocks traditional China, and it's still today very much revered in China. Not so much in Taiwan, but very much discussed. And as Professor Wu and Professor Yu are talking, Professor Wu relates how he was there at one of the universities of California. This story is published in 1971. He's talking about the late 1960s there with the protest in Vietnam breaking out on campus. Students are in his class listening to his boring lectures on the Tang Dynasty, and they're like, why does this even matter? So Professor Wu says, hey, y'all think what is happening out there on your quad is a revolution? Let me tell you about the time I almost started a revolution. And then Professor Wu goes on to tell them about his involvement in the May 4th movement, and the American students are captivated by his story. Chinese people, those kids who are good at math and playing the piano and stuff, how is it possible that they could have a revolution? And that's the main point of the story. Professor Wu and Professor Yu are wondering how much of a difference did their attempt at a revolution in 1919 make? Did they actually change anything? Most of their revolutionary goals were never achieved. I love this story for a couple of reasons. So the sense of melancholy pervades this story, and it's really touching. I taught this story in my Taiwanese literature class a couple of months ago, and the main point of the story is that the revolution failed. And as I'm teaching this class all across the U.S., all across the world, this was in late April, early May of 2024, all across the U.S., all across the world, there are numerous pro-Palestinian protests going on. In fact, just about 200 meters from the classroom where I was actually teaching, there were 100 University of Oregon students camping out in front of Lillis Hall, demanding that the UO divest from Israel. And I asked my students, we just read this story, and this story is all about questioning the value of these protests. It's all about questioning, did we really change anything with our protest in 1919, or was it a complete failure? The story is haunted by this melancholic question, did we really change anything? So I asked my students, did reading this story change y'all's perspective on the protest? And they were like, nope, not a bit. I really wanted to have an interesting discussion of the history and protest and comparing what was happening on campus in 2024 to what happened in Chinese campuses in 1919, but my students just weren't having it. And honestly, I didn't feel comfortable pushing it. In class, I tell my students I avoid any discussion of politics. And I try and keep that up for the class, though for slightly different reasons. I don't talk about politics on the podcast because I want it to be a platform for different views. And the best way to make sure that goal is not achieved would be to get knee deep into partisan politics. So I just avoid partisan politics in the podcast. In class, discussion of politics is not something that works. It weakens the authority of the teacher. If students think of you just as a partisan fighter rather than as this kind of authority figure floating above partisan politics, they don't trust you. They don't trust the things you tell them. They have trouble learning. My job as a humanist, and I've told my students this, my job as a humanist professor is not to teach students what to think. It's to teach them how to think. I had a professor at the University of Georgia. He spent all his lectures talking about U.S. politics rather than lecturing on the topic at hand, which was Asian geopolitics. And I swore then and there that if I ever became a professor, I was not going to be like him. If I was a professor, I would not bang on about my personal politics. And now that I've had the chance to teach as a professor, I didn't want to descend into partisan politics, and I felt like if I push students to have that conversation about the protest happening on campus and the protest in the story, I would have been in danger of undercutting that authority that I developed. So the question of protest and politics hangs over this story. It's part of that broader question of exile, that theme that is so important to this story and to all the Bai Xianyong stories in this collection. There's actually another story called The Last Night of Miss Jin Daban. It's about a woman who used to be this actress on stage in Shanghai. She was famous then. She was, the center of the acting world in Shanghai. But then the communists take over. She has to escape to Taipei. She's this used up woman. She's the wife of a businessman. And we see her on her last night on stage, and she's thinking back to 20 years before and when she was at the center of this world of actors and actresses there in Shanghai, and now she's just on the edge of relevance, really. In other words, all of this work is about exile. Like I said earlier, Taiwanese literary modernists, they have this impressive experiment in the modernist genre. It's been largely unrecognized in Western literary circles. Bai Xianyong, I think, is the best of these modernists. I would highly encourage you to check it out. There's a translation into English of Bai Xianyong's Taipei Ren. It's called Taipei People. You can find it on Amazon. I think it has both English and Chinese in it, so if you're studying Chinese, it might actually be a pretty good thing to read. Okay, I think this is a good place to end it. If you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, please subscribe. That helps with numbers. If you want to show support for the show, find me on Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast at patreon.com. Check out the webpage. I've been trying to relatively regularly put up an AI-generated script from the podcast there, just in case you want to read the podcast rather than listen to it. I don't always do that, but I do try. While you're at the webpage, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com, why not pre-order my forthcoming book that is really interfering in my producing the podcast, and sorry about that. The book is called China's Backstory, the Literature and History Behind Today's Front Page China News. If you want to pre-order, no credit card needed, just need that email address. Check it out on the webpage there. There's a link to it. I was wondering what I was going to do next for the podcast. I'm thinking I'm going to continue doing this Taiwanese thing. I think it works. I'll keep drawing off the material I've got for the class. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, but I think this is an accidental Taiwanese series. Okay, I think that's enough. I'm going to leave y'all in suspense there. Next podcast, it'll probably come out in 3 to 4 weeks on a Saturday. I'm not really sure. It depends on how much writing I can get done. I can't promise you exactly when it'll come out. It will come out. I can promise you that. I can also promise you that it will be something on Taiwan. Until then, my name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.